as a vine, it's very amorphous. It can take a lot of different shapes. If you see it growing on the side of a tree, for example, it's very thick, woody stems, big leaves, pretty berries. Occasionally you can see it growing along the ground, and it looks a little bit different. It looks more like, sweet potato. It's spreading out, looking a little more vine-like. So it can be sort of tree-like and vine-like, depending on where it's growing and what, where you happen to be. But the usual old adage of leaves of three, let it be, is a pretty good one. Doesn't do well in low light. If you're in the middle of the forest, for example, and it's a dense forest, you almost will never find poison ivy. What you tend to find is that it grows along the edge of the forest. Now, last year we cooperated with Duke University that we were able to show that poison ivy not only responds to future changes in CO2, but appears to have responded quite strongly to the change in CO2 that's already occurred. It got bigger faster, and the other thing that we looked at was the change in the ritiol, which is the oil in poison ivy that causes you to break out in a rash when you come in contact with it. There was a more virulent form of that ritiol that was produced in the Duke study when you gave poison ivy more CO2. We looked at how poison ivy has already responded to the change in atmospheric CO2 from about 1950 to today, which is a change of only about 100 parts per million. That is, back in 1950, the CO2 concentration was about 300 parts per million, and today it's close to 400 parts per million. So we wanted to see if, in fact, poison ivy was sensitive enough to respond to even small changes in CO2 that have already occurred in the atmosphere. And what we found was that in doing this laboratory study, that we found that poison ivy was, in fact, able to more or less double in size, even with 100 part per million change in CO2. So what that indicated to us is that it sort of confirmed what we saw in the Duke study, but it said that poison ivy is, in fact, so sensitive that these data suggest that it's already responded to the change in CO2 that's occurred in the atmosphere in the latter half of the 20th century. The first step is to look at the woody tissue of long-term poison ivy, that is poison ivy that's been around for several decades, and to see whether or not the growth rings of the poison ivy have changed, just like tree growth rings have changed, in response to changing CO2. And the second step is to sort of probably look at urban areas. With urban areas, what you see is that the city, for example, is already warmer relative to the surrounding countryside, and the city almost produces a little more CO2 than the surrounding countryside. And of course, warmer temperatures and more carbon dioxide are what are associated with climate changes 50 years from now.